The life of a pharaoh's wife was very interesting during ancient times. And if you were a king, you could have multiple wives, but only one queen. But what about the other women who slept with the pharaohs? These were not prostitutes, but actually concubines. They were women who had special status in the royal court, yet were not considered as the pharaoh's wife. Now, during the time of the Egyptian Empire, it was customary for the rulers of other nations to offer women as gifts to the pharaohs. Even though the concubines had a respectable position in the royal court, they were still seen as possessions of the pharaoh and were expected to bear him children. And if they failed to do so, they would be replaced, because it was believed that younger women were more fertile and could bear more children to the pharaoh. In fact, there was a record of a pharaoh's wife who was only 13 years old when she entered the royal court. However, age wasn't the only factor considered while choosing a concubine. Pharaohs also preferred women who were physically attractive and had certain skills like singing, dancing, and playing instruments. Most of the pharaoh's concubines met a gruesome end, as the pharaohs often got bored of them and decided to get rid of them. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. Sometimes the pharaohs ordered the concubines to be put to death, and other times they were simply banished from the empire with all their wealth and possessions confiscated. However, there were rare cases when the concubines managed to escape the palace and live the rest of their lives in anonymity. They also needed to be well educated and cultured, as they were expected to engage in meaningful conversations with the pharaoh. Also, it was preferred that the concubines gave birth to sons, as they would ensure the continuation of the royal bloodline. And usually, the marriages were set up between the concubine and some member of the royal court. For example, one pharaoh ordered that one of his concubines be married to his vizier, and because of that, the concubines didn't have much freedom. They weren't allowed to leave the royal palace unless they were summoned by the pharaoh, and even then, they had to travel in style, usually in a golden chariot pulled by horses. Also, the pharaohs expected their concubines to be available to them at all times, and they would often summon them in the middle of the night for their pleasure. To top it all off, the concubines weren't even allowed to have their own children with them in the palace. If a concubine gave birth to a child, the child would be taken away immediately and raised in the royal court. While it may seem like an ordinary practice, remember that these were the days when love marriages were unheard of, and people were basically commodities to be traded between families. But despite this, there were instances when the concubines fell in love with the person they were married to. And if the concubine gave birth to a daughter, she would be considered lucky if she managed to live past infancy, as most of these babies died quite young. And these rivals could be other concubines, or even the pharaoh's wife. Remember, the wife of the pharaoh had the highest status among all the women in the empire, and the concubines were always trying to impress the pharaoh so that he would notice them and favor them among all the other women. And if they managed to do so, they could gain more power and influence in the royal court. And if you think that the rivalry was only among the women, you'd be wrong. The male courtiers also had their own rivalries, and they would often try to sabotage each other to gain the pharaoh's favor. Additionally, while a pharaoh could have as many wives as he wanted, each wife was given a specific role and responsibility. And similarly, the concubines also had particular tasks assigned to them based on their individual skills. And most of these women were beautiful and young and would become the pharaoh's concubines. For example, when the Hittite king Hattusili III offered his daughter in marriage to Ramesses II, he also sent along 20 young maidens who would serve as concubines to the Egyptian pharaoh. Similarly, when the Nubian king Kashta sent his daughter to marry the Egyptian pharaoh Pi, he also presented 25 beautiful women to be the pharaoh's concubines. Not only were these women considered valuable gifts, but they also helped strengthen the bond between the two nations. However, it must have been really nerve-wracking for these women, as they were basically offered as gifts without knowing what kind of person they would end up serving. However, they still bore the pharaoh children, so their role was quite important. But despite this, the life of these women was rather disturbing. Welcome to my channel. And today, let us look at 10 disturbing things that were normal for Pharaoh concubines in ancient Egypt. Being a concubine of the pharaoh meant that you lived in luxury and comfort. The pharaoh lavished expensive gifts on his concubines to keep them happy. These gifts could range from jewelry made out of gold and precious stones to chariots pulled by teams of horses. And the pharaohs spared no expense when it came to showering their concubines with gifts. Also, the more children a concubine bore to the pharaoh, the more valuable gifts she received. However, if a concubine displeased the pharaoh, the gifts stopped coming, and sometimes they were even banished from the empire. Number 1. You had to win a beauty contest. Now, if you want to become a pharaoh's concubine, you need to be pretty. We all know that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It might surprise you that during the time of the Egyptian Empire, you didn't need to be born into royalty to have a chance at becoming a pharaoh's wife. In fact, most of the female pharaohs, like Cleopatra, had commoners as their lovers. So even though being a pharaoh's concubine was a prestigious position, it wasn't exclusive for royals. For example, there was a case when Ramesses II, one of the most powerful pharaohs of the Egyptian Empire, had a fling with a woman named Ait, who was a commoner. And their love story became famous throughout Egypt, as there were several pieces of art depicting them together. Also, pharaohs weren't allowed to marry their subjects, and that included their own family members. This law was created to avoid any kind of complications in the bloodline. That is why when Ramesses II married his sister, it caused quite a scandal. But he was also known for having many concubines from all social classes. But during the time of the Egyptian Empire, there were some general standards for beauty that everybody kind of followed. For example, back then, having an hourglass figure was a sign of feminine beauty. Women who were too fat or too thin were considered unattractive. And as for the men, they had to be tall and muscular. So if you wanted to become a pharaoh's concubine, you needed to win a beauty contest where the best-looking men and women from all over Egypt would participate. And of course, since you are competing for the attention of the pharaoh, there will be a lot of pressure. And just like any beauty contest today, it can get really cutthroat. No. 2. Royalty wasn't required. 3. The gift of concubines. Number 4. Having children was paramount. Remember, unlike the wife of the pharaoh, who is considered his equal, the concubines were considered secondary. No. 5. Expensive gifts were expected. 6. They couldn't be too old. One of the main reasons why pharaohs kept young concubines was number 7, arranged marriages. Much like the marriage of the pharaoh, the marriage of the concubines was also arranged. Number 8, concubines had rivals. Just like in a beauty contest, every concubine had her own rivals. 9, no freedom. As we mentioned before, the pharaohs treated their concubines like prized possessions. Number 10, getting out alive was a miracle. Now, getting chosen by the pharaoh as his concubine was considered a great honor, but it was also dangerous. Well, folks, that's all for today. Tell us in the comments below what you found the most interesting about the life of a pharaoh's concubine.